My vegan friend asked where I wanted to eat. I suggested a place with vegan and meat options. She posted that I'm forcing my carnivore agenda and tried to get me fired. I met Bethany 3 years ago at a pottery class where she spent most of the session lecturing everyone about how ceramic glazes contained animal products, and we were all complicit in exploitation. She was shaped like a bowling ball with arms that barely reached around her middle, constantly out of breath from walking upstairs, but somehow convinced that her plant-based diet made her morally superior to everyone else in the room. Despite her exhausting personality, I felt sorry for her because she seemed genuinely lonely. She'd moved to our city for a marketing job at a tech startup and didn't know anyone. I figured everyone deserves at least one friend. So when she asked if I wanted to grab lunch sometime, I said yes, thinking I could handle her quirks if it meant helping someone feel less isolated. Our first lunch together should have been a warning sign about what was coming. I suggested a casual bistro downtown that had both regular and vegan menu options, thinking this would be perfect for accommodating both our preferences. Bethany spent 20 minutes interrogating our server about every ingredient in the vegan pasta, demanding to know if the kitchen used separate pans for cooking meat and whether any animal products touched the surfaces where her food was prepared. The poor server looked increasingly uncomfortable as Bethany's questions became more aggressive and detailed. She wanted to know about the sourcing of every vegetable, whether the restaurant's suppliers used animal fertilizer, and if the cleaning products contained any animal-derived ingredients. I apologized to our server twice during this interrogation, mortified by how my new friend was treating someone just trying to do their job. When our food arrived, Bethany photographed her salad from multiple angles while explaining to nearby tables about the environmental benefits of plant-based eating. She spoke loudly enough that other diners turned to stare, some rolling their eyes at her impromptu lecture about factory farming. I ate my sandwich quietly, hoping she'd calm down once she started eating, but instead, she critiqued my choice to order turkey. "That sandwich represents the suffering of an innocent bird who died for 15 minutes of taste pleasure," she said, pointing at my food with her fork. "You could have ordered the same sandwich with their plant-based protein substitute. The substitute costs $3 more and tastes like cardboard." But I didn't argue. I just nodded and tried to change the subject to her new job, hoping to find safer conversational territory. Over the following months, our friendship developed a pattern where I constantly walked on eggshells to avoid triggering her food-related lectures. She'd invite me to restaurants that only served vegan food, most of which were expensive and left me hungry afterward. When I suggested places with diverse menu options, she'd spend the entire meal analyzing other diners' food choices and making loud comments about their moral failings. Bethany's social media presence became increasingly militant as she gained confidence in her new identity as a vegan activist. She posted daily photos of her meals with lengthy captions, explaining why everyone should adopt her lifestyle immediately. Her Instagram stories featured screenshots of articles about factory farming, climate change, and animal rights, always accompanied by her own commentary about how non-vegans were destroying the planet through their selfish food choices. The breaking point in our friendship came when I made the mistake of suggesting we try a new restaurant that had just opened near my apartment. The place had gotten excellent reviews for having creative options for different dietary preferences, including an extensive vegan menu alongside their regular offerings. I thought this would be perfect for us, somewhere we could both find something we wanted to eat without drama. When I texted Bethany about the restaurant suggestion, her response was immediate and explosive. She sent me a screenshot of their menu with angry red circles drawn around every meat dish, demanding to know why I would suggest a place that profits from animal murder. She followed this with a lecture about how supporting restaurants that serve meat makes me complicit in the suffering of innocent creatures, regardless of whether I personally order vegan options. I tried explaining that I thought she'd appreciate having multiple vegan choices and that we could both be happy there, but she interpreted my suggestion as a personal attack on her values. She said I was trying to force her to compromise her ethics for my convenience, that suggesting a mixed-menu restaurant was the same as asking her to eat at a steakhouse. The conversation escalated quickly from there into territory I hadn't expected. Bethany accused me of never truly supporting her lifestyle change and said she was tired of friends who claimed to be allies while secretly undermining her commitment to animal rights. She demanded I explain why I couldn't just accept her restaurant suggestions instead of constantly pushing for places that served what she called death on plates. Her texts became increasingly aggressive and personal, attacking my character rather than discussing the restaurant choice. The situation became surreal when she started posting about our private conversation on her social media accounts. She screenshot our text exchange and shared it with her followers, describing me as a toxic friend who was trying to sabotage her ethical choices. She painted herself as a victim being persecuted for her compassionate lifestyle, while portraying me as a carnivore pushing my agenda on innocent vegans who just wanted to eat in peace. Her Instagram post about our conversation got dozens of comments from her vegan followers, most of whom had never met me, but felt qualified to judge my character based on her selective screenshots. They called me selfish, close-minded, and morally bankrupt for suggesting a restaurant that dared to serve both plants and animals. Several commenters shared their own stories about toxic friends who didn't support their vegan journeys, turning my private disagreement with Bethany into ammunition for their own grievances. What made the social media pile-on particularly frustrating was how Bethany had edited our conversation to remove context and make me look worse. She posted my suggestion about the mixed menu restaurant, but left out her initial request for restaurant recommendations. She shared my explanation about wanting us both to be happy with our food choices, but deleted her accusatory response about complicity in animal murder. Her followers were responding to a heavily edited version of our conversation that painted me as the aggressor. The harassment escalated when some of her more militant followers decided to take action beyond just commenting on her posts. They looked up my social media profiles and began leaving aggressive comments on my photos, calling me an animal abuser and a fake friend. Several sent direct messages with graphic images from factory farms, claiming they wanted to educate me about the consequences of my food choices. One particularly unhinged follower sent me a link to footage of slaughterhouse operations with the message that my burger habits made me personally responsible for this suffering. I tried reaching out to Bethany privately to ask her to remove the posts and stop the harassment campaign, but she doubled down instead of de-escalating. She claimed I was trying to silence her voice and prevent her from sharing her truth about toxic friendships. She said removing the posts would be betraying the vegan community that had supported her through this difficult situation. Her response made it clear she was enjoying the attention and victim status more than she cared about preserving our friendship. The situation took a darker turn when Bethany discovered where I worked and decided to involve my employer in her campaign against me. She found our company's contact information and sent a lengthy email to my boss describing me as someone who harasses and discriminates against people based on their dietary choices. She claimed I was creating a hostile environment for vegan employees and suggested my behavior violated company policies about workplace respect and inclusion. Her email to my boss was a masterpiece of manipulation and selective truth-telling. She described herself as a concerned community member who felt obligated to report my problematic behavior toward people with ethical dietary restrictions. She included screenshots of our text conversation, again edited to remove context, along with links to articles about discrimination against vegans in workplace settings. She suggested the company should investigate my fitness for a customer-facing role, given my apparent intolerance for diverse lifestyles. My boss called me into his office the next morning with a confused expression and a printed copy of Bethany's email. He'd never dealt with anything like this before and wasn't sure how to handle accusations about an employee's personal dining preferences affecting their professional conduct. He asked me to explain the situation and seemed relieved when I provided the full context of our conversation, along with unedited screenshots showing Bethany's aggressive responses to my restaurant suggestion. The meeting with my boss was awkward, but ultimately resolved in my favor once he understood the full situation. He recognized that Bethany's complaint was based on a personal disagreement rather than workplace discrimination and assured me that my job wasn't in jeopardy. However, he did ask me to be more careful about my social media presence and avoid engaging with people who might twist my words for their own purposes. Advice that felt like victim blaming, but which I understood from a risk management perspective. Bethany's campaign against me might have ended there if she'd been satisfied with causing me stress and workplace drama. Unfortunately, she seemed to interpret my boss's lack of action as evidence that the system was rigged against vegans and decided to escalate her efforts to get me fired. She began contacting other employees at my company through LinkedIn, trying to rally support for her claim that I was creating a hostile environment for people with ethical dietary choices. Her outreach to my co-workers was bizarre and counterproductive. She sent unsolicited messages to people she'd never met, explaining that they worked with someone who discriminated against vegans and asking them to report my behavior to HR. Most of my colleagues forwarded these messages to me with confused questions about who this person was and why she was contacting them about restaurant preferences. Several mentioned they'd blocked her after receiving multiple follow-up messages when they didn't respond to her initial outreach. The LinkedIn harassment campaign backfired spectacularly when Bethany contacted our company's head of HR, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia, who had little patience for frivolous complaints. Patricia reviewed Bethany's messages and the evidence I'd provided, then sent Bethany a cease and desist letter threatening legal action if she continued contacting our employees. The letter pointed out that her behavior constituted harassment and could result in criminal charges if she persisted in her campaign. Meanwhile, Bethany's social media presence was becoming increasingly unhinged as she doubled down on her victim narrative. She posted daily updates about her struggle against carnivore oppression, describing me as representative of a larger conspiracy to silence vegan voices. Her followers encouraged her extremism, sharing increasingly militant content about direct action against animal abusers and suggesting that peaceful advocacy wasn't enough to create change. Her posts began featuring more extreme rhetoric about the moral bankruptcy of omnivores and the need for aggressive intervention to save innocent animals. She shared articles about vegan activists who'd been arrested for liberating animals from farms, describing them as heroes fighting against a genocidal system. Her comment sections became echo chambers of escalating anger and calls for action against anyone who refused to abandon animal products immediately. The transformation in Bethany's online presence was disturbing to watch. What had started as annoying but relatively harmless food activism had evolved into something resembling radicalization. She began describing non-vegans in dehumanizing terms, calling us murderers, rapists, and accomplices to Holocaust-level atrocities. Her language became increasingly violent and apocalyptic, suggesting that drastic measures were justified to stop the animal agriculture industry. 3 months after our restaurant disagreement, Bethany's extremism reached a crescendo when she announced her intention to begin a purification cleanse that would prepare her for more serious activist work. She described this cleanse in mystical terms, claiming it would clear her body and mind of toxins absorbed from living in a carnivorous society. Her followers celebrated this announcement, praising her commitment and encouraging her to document the process for their inspiration and education. The cleanse Bethany described was essentially a starvation diet disguised as spiritual purification. She planned to consume only water, herbal teas, and small amounts of raw vegetables for an indefinite period until she achieved what she called clarity about her purpose in the animal liberation movement. Her posts about the cleanse were filled with quasi-religious language about sacrifice, purification, and transcendence through suffering, rhetoric that should have alarmed anyone with basic knowledge about eating disorders. Her social media documentation of the cleanse was difficult to watch. Daily photos showed her rapid weight loss and increasingly gaunt appearance, while her captions became more erratic and disconnected from reality. She claimed to be experiencing visions of animal spirits thanking her for her sacrifice and described feeling more connected to the natural world as her body purged itself of carnivorous contamination. Her followers cheered her dedication while seemingly oblivious to the obvious signs of malnutrition and mental distress. 2 weeks into her cleanse, Bethany's posts became sporadic and concerning. Her photos showed someone who was clearly unwell, with hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, and a grayish complexion that suggested serious nutritional deficiencies. Her captions rambled about receiving messages from deceased animals and feeling called to take more drastic action against their oppressors. She mentioned having difficulty concentrating at work and suggested this was because her elevated consciousness made it hard to focus on mundane corporate tasks. The final post on Bethany's social media came 3 weeks into her cleanse. An incoherent ramble about preparing for her ultimate mission to liberate factory-farmed animals through direct action. The accompanying photo showed her looking skeletal and wild-eyed, holding what appeared to be bolt cutters and wearing all-black clothing. Her caption mentioned plans to visit local farms and free as many animals as possible before the carnivorous establishment could stop her righteous mission. After that final post, Bethany's social media went silent. Her followers began posting concerned messages, asking about her well-being and whether anyone had heard from her recently. Several mentioned trying to contact her through various platforms without success. The most dedicated followers organized online to try locating her, sharing her photo, and asking if anyone had seen her in the local area, treating her disappearance like a missing person case. The mystery of Bethany's whereabouts was solved when her boss at the tech startup called me asking if I knew where she was. Apparently, she'd stopped showing up for work without explanation, missing several important client meetings and leaving her projects in chaos. Her boss had found my contact information in her emergency contacts and was hoping I could provide some insight into her sudden absence from both work and social media. I explained to her boss about Bethany's extremist cleanse and the concerning final post about direct action against farms. Her boss was horrified to learn about the extent of her mental decline, admitting they'd noticed erratic behavior at work, but had attributed it to stress rather than the dangerous combination of malnutrition and radicalization. They immediately began procedures to involve HR and potentially law enforcement if she didn't resurface soon. The situation became more serious when local police contacted me, asking about my relationship with Bethany, after receiving reports of someone matching her description trespassing on agricultural properties in the rural areas outside our city. Apparently, several farmers had reported a severely underweight woman in black clothing attempting to cut through fences and release livestock, always fleeing when confronted, but leaving behind evidence of her attempted animal liberation activities. Detective Ray Martinez explained that Bethany's trespassing incidents were escalating and showed signs of increasingly poor judgment that suggested mental health issues rather than calculated activism. Her attempts to free animals were poorly planned and dangerous, both to herself and the animals she was trying to liberate. Several of the animals she'd released had been injured or killed after wandering onto busy roads, making her rescue efforts counterproductive to her stated goals of preventing animal suffering. The police were treating Bethany's case as a mental health emergency rather than simple criminal trespassing, recognizing that her extreme weight loss and erratic behavior indicated someone in crisis rather than a calculating criminal. Detective Martinez asked me to provide background about her recent behavior and social media posts, which would help them understand her state of mind and predict where she might appear next. Her pattern of targeting farms suggested she was working her way through agricultural properties in a systematic way. I provided the detective with screenshots of Bethany's social media posts, documenting her cleanse and radicalization, along with a timeline of her increasingly extreme behavior over the past several months. Detective Martinez was particularly concerned about her posts describing visions and messages from animal spirits, recognizing these as potential signs of psychosis brought on by severe malnutrition. He explained that prolonged starvation could cause hallucinations and paranoid thinking that made people dangerous to themselves and others. The search for Bethany intensified when she was spotted at a large dairy farm 20 miles outside the city, apparently attempting to release hundreds of cows in the middle of the night. The farmer had awakened to the sound of his cattle moving around restlessly and discovered someone with bolt cutters working on his fence gates. When he called out, the figure ran into the darkness, but security cameras captured enough footage to confirm it was Bethany, looking even more skeletal than in her final social media post. Farm security footage showed the extent of Bethany's physical and mental deterioration. She moved erratically and seemed to be talking to herself or to invisible companions, occasionally stopping to gesture at empty space as if responding to someone only she could see. Her attempt to release the cows was poorly executed and would have created chaos rather than liberation, as hundreds of large animals suddenly freed in the middle of the night would likely panic and potentially injure themselves or each other. 2 days later, a neighboring farm reported finding Bethany collapsed in their barn, unconscious and severely dehydrated. She was rushed to the county hospital where doctors worked to stabilize her condition, which had deteriorated to a life-threatening level due to prolonged starvation and exposure. Her weight had dropped to less than 90 pounds, and her body was shutting down from lack of nutrition and the physical stress of her nocturnal farm infiltration activities. The hospital contacted Bethany's family after finding emergency contact information in her phone, bringing her parents from across the country to deal with their daughter's medical and legal situation. They were shocked to see her physical condition and had no idea about her recent extremist activities, as she'd cut off communication with them months earlier when they expressed concerns about her increasingly militant veganism. Her mother broke down crying when she saw how emaciated her daughter had become in pursuit of her purification cleanse. Bethany's parents filled in more background about her history of struggling with obsessive behaviors and difficulty maintaining friendships throughout her life. They explained that she'd always been prone to taking things to extremes, whether it was fitness routines, work projects, or personal interests. Her adoption of veganism had followed this familiar pattern, starting as a reasonable dietary choice, but escalating into an all-consuming identity that crowded out everything else in her life. Her mother mentioned that Bethany had struggled with eating disorders in college, using various restrictive diets as ways to exert control when she felt overwhelmed by other aspects of her life. The family had hoped her move to a new city and new job would help her develop healthier coping mechanisms, but instead, she'd found a new framework for her obsessive tendencies in the form of militant animal rights activism combined with extreme dietary restriction. While Bethany was hospitalized, her social media accounts were flooded with posts from concerned followers demanding updates about her condition and expressing outrage at the system that had driven their hero to such desperate measures. Many blamed carnivorous society for persecuting someone whose only crime was caring too much about innocent animals. They created hashtags calling for justice for Bethany and shared increasingly extreme content about the need for direct action to prevent similar tragedies. The online response to Bethany's hospitalization revealed the echo chamber that had encouraged her descent into extremism. Her followers had reinforced every escalation of her rhetoric and behavior, praising her dedication while ignoring obvious signs of mental and physical distress. They'd celebrated her dangerous cleanse as spiritual purification, rather than recognizing it as disordered eating that required intervention. Their encouragement had enabled her downward spiral, rather than helping her find balance. Detective Martinez interviewed me again after Bethany's arrest for multiple counts of trespassing and attempted property destruction. He wanted to understand the timeline of her radicalization and whether there were warning signs that might help identify others heading down similar paths. I provided him with documentation of her social media evolution, from annoying food activism to dangerous extremism, showing how her rhetoric had escalated gradually over months. The detective was particularly interested in the role of her online community in encouraging her dangerous behavior. He explained that they were seeing more cases of people being radicalized through social media echo chambers that reinforced extreme beliefs and praised increasingly dangerous actions. Bethany's case was unusual because it involved animal rights rather than political extremism, but the pattern of online reinforcement leading to real-world violence was familiar to law enforcement. Bethany's criminal charges were complicated by her obvious mental health crisis and the role that severe malnutrition had played in her decision-making during the farm incidents. Her lawyer argued that she wasn't fully responsible for her actions due to psychological impairment caused by prolonged starvation, while prosecutors maintained that she'd made conscious choices to engage in criminal behavior regardless of her mental state. The court ultimately decided on a combination of criminal penalties and mandatory mental health treatment, recognizing that Bethany needed help more than punishment. She was sentenced to probation with requirements for psychiatric evaluation, nutritional counseling, and community service that specifically prohibited any involvement in animal rights activism until she demonstrated psychological stability. The judge emphasized that her intentions might have been benevolent, but her methods were dangerous and illegal. Bethany's recovery was slow and complicated by her resistance to abandoning the identity she'd built around militant veganism. Hospital nutritionists struggled to convince her to eat adequate calories, as she continued to view food as morally contaminated rather than medically necessary. Her psychiatric team had to address both the eating disorder aspects of her case and the extremist ideological framework that had justified her dangerous behavior. Her parents worked with therapists to understand how their daughter's lifelong pattern of obsessive behavior had manifested in this particularly dangerous form. They learned about the warning signs they'd missed and strategies for supporting her recovery without enabling future extremism. The process was painful as they recognized how her isolation and need for belonging had made her vulnerable to radicalization through online communities that praised her increasingly dangerous dedication. 6 months after her hospitalization, Bethany reached out to me through her therapist, asking if I would be willing to participate in a session focused on making amends for the damage she'd caused to my life and career. Her therapist explained that taking responsibility for her actions was an important part of her recovery, but that she needed to do this in a controlled environment where she could receive support if she became overwhelmed by guilt and shame. The therapy session was awkward, but ultimately productive. Bethany looked healthier physically, having regained weight and color in her face, but she seemed fragile emotionally as she worked to rebuild her identity around something other than militant activism. She apologized for the social media harassment campaign and attempts to get me fired, acknowledging that her behavior had been disproportionate and harmful, regardless of her intentions to promote animal welfare. She explained that her therapists had helped her understand how her eating disorder had intersected with ideological extremism to create a perfect storm of dangerous behavior. The restriction and control involved in both veganism and her purification cleanse had fed into her psychological need for rigid rules and moral superiority. Her online community had provided the validation and belonging she craved while encouraging increasingly extreme expressions of dedication. Bethany's recovery involved learning to maintain her ethical concerns about animal welfare while developing healthier ways to express these values that didn't involve self-starvation or criminal activity. Her nutritionists worked with her to develop a sustainable plant-based diet that met her caloric needs, while her therapists helped her find animal advocacy organizations that focused on education and legal reform rather than direct action that could trigger her obsessive tendencies. The process of rebuilding her life was complicated by the criminal record she'd acquired during her extremist phase and the professional reputation damage from her erratic behavior at work. Her former employer had been understanding about her mental health crisis, but they couldn't overlook the abandoned projects and missed meetings that had affected their clients. She had to start over with a new job and gradually rebuild trust with colleagues who might discover her background. Her relationship with social media required careful management as part of her recovery plan. The online communities that had encouraged her extremism continued to exist, and she had to develop strategies for avoiding content that might trigger obsessive thinking patterns. Her therapist recommended limiting her online exposure and focusing on real-world relationships and activities that provided fulfillment without the validation cycles that had contributed to her radicalization. 2 years after our restaurant disagreement that had started this whole nightmare, Bethany and I had developed a cautious but genuine friendship based on mutual understanding of how her mental health crisis had affected both our lives. She continued to follow a plant-based diet, but had learned to express her animal welfare concerns through volunteering at legitimate rescue organizations, rather than through confrontational activism or social media campaigns. Our friendship was different from what it had been before, built on honesty about the serious consequences of untreated mental health issues and the importance of maintaining balance in political and ethical commitments. She'd learned to recognize the warning signs of her obsessive thinking patterns and had developed strategies for seeking help when she felt herself sliding toward extremism. I'd learned about the complex relationship between eating disorders and ideological movements that provide frameworks for restriction and control. Bethany's story became something of a cautionary tale within animal rights communities about the dangers of encouraging extreme behavior in vulnerable individuals. Several advocacy organizations updated their approaches to emphasize sustainable, healthy activism rather than praising dramatic gestures that might appeal to people struggling with underlying psychological issues. Her case highlighted the need for movement leaders to recognize when followers were expressing dedication in ways that suggested mental health problems rather than genuine commitment. The experience taught me about the fine line between supporting friends through lifestyle changes and enabling behavior that becomes dangerous to their well-being. I'd initially tried to be accommodating of Bethany's veganism without recognizing the warning signs that it was becoming an obsession rather than simply a dietary preference. Learning to identify these patterns and respond appropriately became an important skill for maintaining healthy relationships with people, exploring new identities and belief systems. Looking back, the entire situation could have been avoided if I'd been more alert to the signs that Bethany's veganism was becoming psychologically unhealthy rather than just socially annoying. Her aggressive restaurant behavior, social media militancy, and increasing isolation from friends and family were all indicators that she was using dietary restrictions as a way to manage underlying emotional issues that needed professional attention rather than ideological reinforcement. 3 years later, Bethany continues her recovery with ongoing therapy and nutritional counseling, maintaining her plant-based diet as one aspect of a balanced life rather than as the central organizing principle of her identity. She works for a nonprofit focused on sustainable agriculture, channeling her environmental concerns into productive work that doesn't trigger her obsessive tendencies. Our friendship has survived the crisis and grown stronger through honest communication about mental health and the importance of seeking help when ethical commitments begin interfering with practical life functioning.